The United States has long prided itself on being the world's agricultural powerhouse, particularly when it comes to corn. Generations of American farmers have fed both domestic markets and international buyers, shipping millions of tons each year across oceans to countries hungry for dependable grain. But today, that image of strength is under pressure. Across the Midwest, farmers are staring at spreadsheets that simply don't add up. Corn prices have fallen below the break-even line for many, while the cost of seeds, fertilizer, pesticides, and fuel has surged. For a business that already relies on thin margins, the equation is breaking down. Growers describe the moment as surreal. One Iowa farmer summed it up bluntly, "I never thought I'd lose this much money this fast." Their words reflect the reality on the ground. Acres of golden stalks sway in the wind, but the sound of harvest is missing. Combines are idle. Buyers who once rushed to lock in shipments have disappeared, and contracts once destined for China and other top importers now sit in limbo. Families who have tilled the same soil for decades are watching their season, and in some cases their legacy, slip away. North of the border, the contrast couldn't be sharper. Canada is moving aggressively to capture market share. By sealing long-term agreements with Japan, South Korea, and the European Union, Canadian exporters are redirecting global attention their way. While American grain piles up in storage, Canadian shipments are sailing toward ports worldwide. The speed of this reversal has shocked many in U.S. agriculture. How did the U.S. lose its grip so quickly? Who engineered the changes in global demand? And most importantly, what does this mean for the future of American farming? The story begins with tariffs that undermined American competitiveness long before the grain could leave domestic ports. When Washington imposed steep duties on Chinese-built cargo vessels, shipping costs jumped overnight. Sending grain down the Mississippi River and through the Gulf of Mexico became significantly more expensive. Exporters faced surcharges that lifted transportation costs by nearly 25%, draining hundreds of millions from farmer revenues. On the Pacific side, container rates doubled to around $5,000 each. For an industry already struggling to recover from pandemic-era bottlenecks, this was a devastating blow. But transportation costs were only the first wave of challenges. By early 2025, another obstacle hit hard. The Federal Grain Inspection Service introduced tougher pesticide residue rules, requiring all shipments to pass a stricter chemical threshold before leaving U.S. shores. Testing fees spiked by 40%, and if a load failed partway through its journey, it risked rejection and costly returns. Barges on the Mississippi River slowed dramatically, falling well below the 5-year average. At the port of New Orleans, the scene grew grim. Rows of ships sat waiting for inspections, paperwork, and scarce containers. Grain darkened in the rain while farmers watched profits evaporate. Industry analysts estimated that each week of delay shaved roughly 27 cents off every bushel. Across Iowa and Indiana, that loss accumulated at a pace no farm operation could withstand for long. The crisis extended beyond shipping delays. Global buyers responding to consumer demands began insisting on corn that wasn't only abundant, but also clean, traceable, and environmentally responsible. This shift toward sustainability and transparency exposed a weakness in the American system. In February, Mexico, historically one of the U.S. most reliable buyers, announced a ban on imports of genetically modified corn. Within weeks, feed mills across Asia and Europe began inserting similar clauses into their contracts. The shock was severe. More than 90% of U.S. corn acreage is genetically modified. Practically overnight, American corn was removed from the list of preferred suppliers. Canada, however, had been preparing for this moment for years. Through its Prairie Trace blockchain system, Canadian exporters could provide buyers with digital proof of every step in the supply chain, from seed to shipping container. Their grain came with low-carbon certification, pesticide transparency, and sustainability guarantees. It wasn't just corn, it was a product with a story, one that resonated with environmentally conscious governments and consumers alike. Global buyers rewarded that readiness. Within a matter of weeks, Canadian exporters locked in billions of dollars worth of new long-term contracts, displacing American suppliers who had once been dominant. The consequences for U.S. farmers were swift and brutal. Spot corn prices in the Midwest tumbled to $3.45 per bushel, the lowest in nearly a decade. Meanwhile, corn grown in Manitoba commanded $4.20 per bushel, reflecting the premium attached to traceability and environmental compliance. Buyers were no longer waiting for U.S. producers to catch up. they had found new partners who could meet evolving standards. Contracts with Midwest cooperatives were abruptly canceled. Silos overflowed with unsold grain. Barges sat idle at riverbanks. The nation that once anchored global grain markets was watching its position erode in real time. And while the U.S. struggled to regain footing, Canada's momentum only accelerated. Every container leaving Canadian ports reinforced its reputation as a reliable and progressive supplier. The trust that global buyers placed in Canada had become a currency nearly as valuable as the grain itself. The pain from collapsing corn prices didn't stop at the farm gate. It spread through every layer of the rural economy. Across Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois, towns that had long depended on grain sales to fuel their schools, restaurants, and small businesses began to feel the weight of the downturn. By late summer, U.S. corn stockpiles swelled to their highest levels in 6 years. The USDA projected that more than 2.5 billion bushels, roughly 68 million tons, would remain unsold heading into the harvest season. In Cedar Rapids, full delivery corn contracts were trading at just $3.74 per bushel, far below the break-even threshold. For many farms, the average cost of inputs hovered around $165 per acre, making the math impossible to sustain. Some farmers parked their combines, deciding not to harvest at all. The heartbreaking calculation was simple. It would cost more to bring the crop in than to leave it in the field. The stress fractured families and communities. For some, selling equipment became the only lifeline. Others quietly took night shifts in nearby towns just to keep mortgage payments flowing. In Indiana, the ripple effects dragged the state's economy down by more than 6% in the first quarter of 2025. Food banks reported record demand as families who had once grown enough to feed half the nation now stood in line for donated meals. The Food Bank of Indiana issued warnings that over 130 million meals for low-income households could disappear as surplus grain programs dried up alongside federal funding. The crisis was not limited to one state. In Illinois, another long-standing challenge returned with a vengeance: the Mississippi River's low water levels. For the third straight year, drought conditions forced shippers to lighten loads and shorten tow configurations. Each ton of corn suddenly cost an additional $20 to move. Barges were backed up for weeks, clogging the arteries of the Midwest's grain economy. Storage bins across the countryside filled to capacity, leaving farmers with nowhere to put new harvests. That glut opened the door for large land investment firms to buy distressed farms at bargain prices, reshaping ownership patterns in rural America. Meanwhile, the ethanol industry, once a vital pressure valve for excess corn, was buckling under its own strain. Production capacity in the Midwest slipped below 88%, with more than 24 ethanol plants idled. Facilities that once converted grain into renewable fuel were now ghostly reminders of the industry's fragility. In Columbus, Nebraska, Valero cut its night shift in half, laying off more than 100 workers. Every shuttered plant meant less demand for corn, deepening the surplus problem and sending another wave of unemployment across rural communities. What had once been a tightly interwoven system, from the fields of Iowa to the silos of Illinois and the processing plants of Nebraska, was beginning to unravel. Corn, once a symbol of American agricultural strength, was transforming into a burden. Families that had relied on grain for generations were watching it weigh down their livelihoods instead of lifting them up. Canada, on the other hand, continued to turn its disciplined strategy into tangible gains. Each shipment leaving Vancouver or Halifax was accompanied by digital records, pesticide clarity, and low-carbon certification. For international buyers, it wasn't just grain, it was a story they could sell to their customers, one that aligned with rising environmental and health priorities. Old crop basis prices in Ontario jumped as much as $1.87 above Chicago futures, while even new crop sales commanded premiums of 18% or more. Buyers were signaling with their wallets. They weren't simply chasing the cheapest grain anymore. They were investing in confidence and compliance. The Canadian government played a pivotal role in strengthening that confidence. In March 2025, Canada finalized an organic equivalency agreement with South Korea. Under the deal, Canadian grain carrying the proper certification could bypass additional inspections once it reached Korean ports. The result was immediate. Ontario cooperatives secured 5-year contracts, while Saskatchewan quickly followed with long-term supply agreements in Japan and the Netherlands. The weak Canadian dollar only sweetened the deals, making Canadian grain even more attractive compared to U.S. alternatives burdened by tariffs and uncertainty. Financial institutions also supported the shift. Export Development Canada rolled out insurance packages covering individual shipments, offering protection against delays or damage. They even reimbursed costs tied to low-emission transportation, helping exporters highlight their sustainability edge. Rail companies joined in, optimizing routes to bring prairie grain to Pacific ports more efficiently. Some lines even picked up discounted U.S. cargo on their return trips from Asia, underscoring the irony. American grain was now sometimes moving under Canadian logistics networks. The difference in momentum was striking. The very same week that Canada announced its agreement with South Korea, the USDA recorded a 14% year-over-year drop in vessel bookings from Gulf ports. Contracts shrank. Ships sat empty. Buyers who once filled U.S. order books with confidence were now quietly turning away. The silence from international markets spoke volumes. For American farmers, the reality was clear. Canada hadn't just stolen sales, it had stolen trust. Global buyers no longer saw the U.S. as a reliable partner. They saw a supplier weighed down by tariffs, rigid inspections, and outdated policies. Meanwhile, Canada projected consistency, transparency, and readiness for the future. Grain markets run on more than yield, they run on reputation. And by 2025, that reputation was slipping from the hands of U.S. producers into the grasp of their northern neighbors. The collapse of U.S. corn exports was more than a temporary setback. It was a warning shot for the rest of American agriculture. If corn could fall from dominance so quickly, what would stop the same from happening to soybeans, wheat, or even livestock? Soybeans are already showing cracks. Like corn, over 90% of U.S. soybean acreage is genetically modified. That alone makes them vulnerable in markets where consumers and regulators are demanding traceability and non-GMO assurance. European buyers, for instance, have already flagged U.S. soybeans as incompatible with their low-carbon sourcing requirements. If contracts begin to exclude genetically modified soy, American producers could see billions in sales evaporate, and the effects wouldn't end at the farm. Soy is a critical component of livestock feed. If U.S. beans are rejected abroad, global supply chains will adjust, and so will consumer preferences. Beef and dairy producers could be next in line. Feed standards are changing, with buyers looking for meat raised on sustainable, low-carbon diets. Australia and Canada have already pledged to deliver net zero beef by 2030. These commitments give them a head start in winning premium buyers, from European supermarkets to Asian luxury markets. If U.S. producers can't provide the same assurances, their share of these lucrative sectors will shrink. The ripple effects are enormous. Fewer sales mean fewer cattle, less demand for feed, and deeper strain on rural communities. The challenge is not simply about what's being grown, but how it's being grown, and how it's being presented to the world. Buyers are no longer content with volume alone. They want proof of sustainability, traceability, and fairness built into every transaction. For now, Canada and other competitors are supplying that proof, while the U.S. struggles to adapt. This puts Washington at a crossroads. The decisions made in the next few years will shape whether American agriculture regains its competitive edge or watches its influence erode further. One possible path is reform. Dismantling punitive tariffs would ease the cost of exporting. Providing farmers with tools for green farming, such as subsidies for sustainable inputs, incentives for regenerative practices, and funding for advanced logistics, could align U.S. grain with global expectations. National traceability standards could restore confidence with buyers who want to know where their food comes from and how it was produced. Reform would also mean rebuilding trust internationally, repairing relationships with key partners who've turned elsewhere. These changes would require political will and swift action, but they could stabilize a collapsing sector before the damage becomes irreversible. The other path is to continue with the status quo. That would mean keeping trade walls high, maintaining inspection regimes that slow down exports, and relying on subsidies to fill the gap between production costs and falling market prices. But history suggests that subsidies alone cannot repair reputational damage. Buyers don't want handouts. They want consistency, transparency, and progress. If Washington chooses to double down on protectionism, American farmers could remain trapped in a cycle of oversupply, shrinking margins, and dwindling global relevance. Meanwhile, competitors are not standing still. Canada is using its advantage to secure long-term relationships with major buyers. Australia is marketing not only beef, but also wheat and barley as part of its low-carbon export strategy. South American nations like Brazil and Argentina are expanding acreage and positioning themselves as reliable suppliers in both grain and protein. The US is not just losing individual sales, it is losing entire markets. Once those markets establish new supply chains, winning them back becomes increasingly difficult. Beyond economics, the shift carries geopolitical weight. Agricultural exports have always been a pillar of US soft power. They represent not just food, but also influence. When countries depend on American grain, they engage diplomatically with Washington. When that reliance weakens, so does US leverage abroad. By ceding agricultural ground to Canada, Brazil, or Australia, the US risks losing more than money. It risks losing voice in shaping global food policy. For the farmers on the ground, however, the crisis is intensely personal. They are not thinking about geopolitical strategy when they decide whether to harvest or walk away from a crop. They are thinking about mortgages, family legacies, and whether their children will want or even be able to carry on the farm. In coffee shops across the Midwest, conversations once filled with weather updates and market prices are now clouded with uncertainty. Should they plant next season? Should they downsize? Should they sell? These questions are no longer hypothetical, they are immediate. The frustration among farmers is compounded by a sense of betrayal. Many feel that the policies creating today's challenges were avoidable. Tariffs that raised shipping costs, inspection rules that slowed exports, and a lack of preparation for sustainability standards all combined into a storm that producers could not control. They worked the same land with the same dedication as their parents and grandparents, but the rules of the global market shifted, and no one in Washington seemed ready. Yet amid the bleakness, there is still a chance for renewal. The U.S. agricultural sector has reinvented itself before. From the Dust Bowl of the 1930s to the farm crises of the 1980s, American farmers have endured, adapted, and rebuilt. Today's challenge may feel different because it is tied to global perceptions as much as local production, but adaptation is still possible. Farmers are resourceful, and if given the right tools, transparent certification systems, support for low-carbon practices, and competitive trade terms, they could compete with anyone in the world. The bigger question is whether policymakers will act in time. Every season that passes without reform deepens Canada's advantage and cements global buyers' trust in alternative suppliers. Every delay allows competitors to set the rules of the future food economy. If the US waits too long, catching up may no longer be an option. For now, the image is stark. Corn piling up in American silos while Canadian shipments sail confidently toward global markets. Families in the Midwest grappling with losses while Canadian cooperatives sign 5-year deals. Empty barges in the Gulf while ports in Vancouver and Halifax hum with activity. The shift is real, and it is reshaping agriculture's balance of power. The U.S. still has time to turn the tide, but the window is narrowing. Will Washington choose reform, or will it cling to old strategies as markets move on? The answer will decide not only the fate of American corn, but the future of U.S. agriculture as a whole. So now the question turns to you. If you were planning the nation's future, would you push for reform and global alignment, or would you defend the current system despite its costs? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.